If you'll take your Bible and open up to Exodus, we're working our way through the books of Moses, and we've come to Exodus, which is such an important part of the Bible because not only does it tell us about how God saves and why God saves, it also tells us who God is. Who is this God that we worship? Open up to the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, one of the things God does is tell us his name. He says he is Yahweh. I am who I am, which is a strange way for God to describe himself. It's an unusual name for God to ask us to call him, which is why God not only tells us his name in the book of Exodus, he also unpacks what exactly that name means. And so as we read the book of Exodus, we're learning about the identity of this God who is Yahweh. He is who he is. So who is he? What do we learn about God from Exodus? We learn, obviously, that he exists. He is present. He is a God who has seen what is going on. He is a God who enters into a relationship with his people. Exodus 3:15. He is the maker of man's mouth. He is sovereign over man's abilities, and he is the God who reveals himself through prophets. Exodus 4:11 and 12. He is the controller of hearts, Exodus 10:1 and 2. He is the purpose of the universe, Exodus 9:15 and 16. He is the owner of all things, Exodus 9:29. He chooses a people for himself, Exodus 11:4 through 7. His ultimate purpose is to put his glorious attributes on display for all to see, Exodus 34:14. As someone has written, he is the creator God, the owner of the earth, who is committed to his covenant with his distinctive people. The plagues and Pharaoh's hard-heartedness is a means through which the entire world will learn about Yahweh's reputation and his commitment to his people. He is sovereign, and he wants people to know it, Exodus 12. One way you see this is in the way God delivers Israel. He delivers Israel through a series of 10 plagues. That's what we call them, but it probably would be better actually to call them 10 signs. If you look at Exodus chapter 7, verse 3, that's actually what God calls them. He says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Nearly every plague was directed at a supposed deity. Listen to how one scholar puts it. Egyptians conceived of their deities as controlling a particular aspect of nature. And certainly we know demonic powers do have some sort of authority in this world. But ultimately, Pharaoh, they thought of Pharaoh as the incarnate God on earth, whose responsibility was to make sure, in a sense, that all these gods were operating as they should. And yet in the plagues or in these signs, God is showing that the Pharaoh is powerless. And, I quote, against the will of Yahweh, these deities were absolutely impotent. When the plagues had run their course, Egypt was in shambles and her religion discredited. None of these reputed powers could resist the will of Yahweh, the God of the seemingly wretched and powerless Hebrews. We can see the way God exalted himself by looking at the 10 signs specifically. First part of Exodus is exciting as we're reading about all these great miracles that God is performing, and yet we have to remember he's performing them for a very specific purpose. It is like God is saying, this is who I am. I am Yahweh, and I alone am God. And now let me prove it. That's part of the purpose of the plagues. In the ancient world, they had all sorts of gods that they worshipped, and as I was saying, in Egypt, Pharaoh was thought to be a human form of a god. And so one of the purposes of the plagues is to show that God is really the one true God. Now, you might think, why is God proving that if these other beings aren't actually gods? But it's like with your children. Sometimes with your children, they might think there's a monster under the bed, and so you'll say, let me prove to you there's no monster under the bed. And the gods the Egyptians were worshiping were not true gods. They may have been demonic spiritual beings, but certainly they did not exist in the same category as the one true God. And so God here is putting his power and majesty on display by showing these demonic spiritual beings that you call gods have nothing on me. Now, though there is only one God, and he's proving it in the way that he delivers Israel, this God is so great, he uses many names to help us understand what he's like. In the Bible, he's called Elohim. That's the most general title for God. He's also called El Elyon, God Most High. That indicates his superior position above all the rulers and authorities in the universe. He's called Adonai, Lord, Master. That reveals God as the owner of all creation. He's called El Shaddai, God Almighty, and that speaks of God's power in creating a sustaining life. He's called El Olam, God Everlasting, which emphasizes, of course, that God has no beginning and God has no end. He's called El Roi, the God of sight, which reveals God's gracious omniscience as the one who sees the needs of his people and cares enough to respond with help and deliverance. He's called Yahweh Sabaoth, Yahweh of hosts, which shows us that God is creator and he is the leader of these heavenly angelic armies. And as we read Exodus, God is showing us what these names mean in the way that he delivers his people. That's why he delivers Israel the way he does. This is my name. Let me show you what my name means. In fact, that's actually why there even is an Israel at all, if you think about it. God delivers Israel in a certain way to say something about himself, but he delivers them as a nation in order to use them to say something about him. And that's a big part of the purpose of the book of Exodus. We have had the foundation in Genesis, the introduction. This is a God. This is who God is. This is what God is doing in the world, and this is who he's doing it through. That's Genesis. And now he's taking all of that and he's starting to put it on display through Israel. In other words, we're reading a lot about Israel. Why is there an Israel? Why are they saved the way they are? Not only does Exodus help us know better who God is, Exodus helps us know who Israel is as well. And it shows us several things. First of all, it shows us that Israel was chosen by God for service. Exodus 4:22. For God so loved the world, he chose Israel. This service is connected to the promise he made Abraham, Exodus 3:24. And one big part of the design of God in delivering Israel is found in Exodus 6:2-8. He intends to bless them. He intends to enter into communion with them. He intends to help them know God and through them help the world know God. And he attempts and desires to pour out on them abundant life. But beyond that, we may say that God chose Israel to be like a second Adam. He was delivering them out of Egypt in order to plant them in a new kind of Garden of Eden. If you look at Exodus chapter 15, verse 17, Moses says, "You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established." Then if you turn to Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 14, you'll find that language again, only there it's talking about Eden. You were an anointed guardian cherub. Maybe that he's talking about Satan. Certainly he's talking about the king of Tyre. I placed you, you were on the holy mountain of God. If you look at Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, God tells Israel, look, if you will diligently listen to my voice and do what's right, here's what I'm going to do. I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. And if you look at Leviticus chapter 26, which we'll do in the future, we see that God intends to to almost rejuvenate Canaan so that it functions the way the world functioned originally, if Israel would obey. But the ultimate purpose of Israel is found in Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. Israel did not exist for Israel. Their blessing wasn't to end with them. God says in Exodus 19, he wanted to make them into a kingdom of priests. And what do priests do? They represent God to the people and the people to God. The whole nation of Israel were to be priests. Priests to who? To the world. They were to represent God to the world and the world to God. As a kingdom of priests, one scholar explains, Israel is called to represent the nations before God, to mediate God's redemptive purpose in the world. The fundamental purpose of priests in Israel was to represent the people before God through their sacrificial and intercession ministry. Yahweh summons Israel as an entire nation to act as a priest, a covenantal mediator before him and the rest of the world. In priestly service, he expects Israel to pray for, love, minister, and witness to the nations. And you see that desire in the Psalms, actually, when God's people are thinking the way they should. The entire nation was to live in God's presence, and we're all to become like priests, standing in the presence of God in his temple and reflecting his glorious light, being intermediaries, go-betweens for the nations who were living in darkness and apart from God. God's plan for the earth was for it to become, again, this is a quote from a scholar, but he says, God's plan for the earth was for it to become a temple city filled with people who have holy or priestly status. Tragically, the actions of Adam and Eve endanger the fulfillment of this project. In spite of this, God graciously and mercifully embarks on a lengthy process designed to reverse this setback and bring to completion his creation scheme. And in Exodus, we're beginning to better understand Israel's role in this process. God delivers Israel so that they would be a nation who would say something about him to the world. But to do that, obviously, they needed to know him and what he's like. He's told them his name, and in order to help them really understand what that name means, he delivers them through these plagues. To be that light to the world, Israel really needed to be convinced that God is really God, and that's why he delivers them the way he does. Because the question being asked in the middle of these plagues is, who is really actually in charge of this world? Exodus chapter 8, verse 19. The magicians say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. It's not us. We're not in charge. The magicians are brought to the point where they say, no, God is God. Exodus chapter 8, verse 11, 10 and verse 10, Moses says, be it as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. Exodus 8:22, why are you doing this? That you may know I am the Lord. And it took a while for Pharaoh to figure that out. There are 10 plagues and they follow a certain pattern. You can actually group them. 3, 3, 3, and then 1. And in the first 2 plagues of each group, you have Moses and Aaron warning Pharaoh. And then in the third plague, there is no warning. The purpose of the first group of plagues is clear. Exodus 7:17. Thus said the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Then the purpose of the second group of plagues is similar, but maybe a little more specific. Exodus 7:22. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret hearts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. But 8:22. It's actually 8:22 where God says that you may know the purpose of the second group of plagues is, but that you may know that I am the Lord in all the earth. And he did that in the second group of plagues by making a distinction between Israel and Egypt. So the first group of plagues were on everybody. Second group of plagues, he says, no, I want you to know I am the Lord in all the earth, and I'm going to send these plagues, but Israel's going to be rescued from them. Then in the third set of plagues, God says his purpose is to make sure everyone knows that he alone is God. Exodus 9:14, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. And then, of course, there's the final plague. And after all these various plagues, it's like at the end we come to the ultimate plague that God uses to deliver Israel. And he calls them to remember that deliverance through something we call the Passover. Exodus 11 tells us about the plague. And then in Exodus 12, he steps back and explains the Passover, which is a celebration God designed to help the people remember the salvation he provided in Egypt. And this is very important. It's, like I said in another video, the oldest celebration in the world today, the oldest celebrated holiday. It's been celebrated for like almost 3,500 years now. And it not only reminded Israel of what God did in the past, it was to be a paradigm to help Israel understand what God was going to do in the future. It's a real event. It happened. It had a purpose. But it also provides a picture of what God was going to do. And as we look back specifically at this final devastating plague that God used to deliver Israel, we'll see that the book of Exodus has gotten us ready for it in some interesting ways, beginning in Exodus 1, verse 22, where Pharaoh tries to kill all the firstborn sons of Israel. And then in Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 and 23, where God calls Israel his firstborn son. So the book begins with the firstborn sons of Israel being attacked, and the rescue happens through God delivering those firstborn sons through the death of a substitute, while the firstborn children of Egypt are dealt a death blow. And after all of these warnings, and after Pharaoh's continual rebellion and hardening of his heart, it is this final blow that brings the final liberation from oppression in Egypt, which was this great tragedy for every Egyptian family, of course. But you know what it was specifically? It was a blow to the Egyptian idea of royal succession. Because you see, the firstborn son of Pharaoh was destined to rule. He was supposed to be the next god on earth, but he's defeated. And instead, it is the firstborn son of Yahweh who rules. And that's actually a big part of what the final plague is about. You see, the question being asked in the middle of all these plagues is, who is really in charge? Is Pharaoh in charge, or is God in charge? And at the end of the first three plagues, the magicians admit it's God. At the end of the sixth plague, the magicians themselves are forced to suffer. At the end of the eighth and ninth plague, Pharaoh confesses his sin and says he will let the people go, but then he hardens his heart. And it's through this final judgment that Pharaoh finally concedes to God's demands and lets Israel go. It's important to note that as he does so, the Egyptians themselves end up blessing God's people as they go, which is cool because Egypt was the greatest superpower on the earth at the time. So that meant they were very rich. And it also meant in the ancient world, everyone would have thought their God was the greatest. But God goes to war against the Egyptians in order to use them to bless Israel and to prove to the entire world that he is the one true God. In fact, in Exodus 12:12, God tells us the purpose of this final plague. He says he's coming to Egypt. He's going to strike their firstborn as a judgment on their gods. And this is a pretty powerful moment. And you might even imagine how the Israelites must have felt when God made the announcement in Exodus 12:12. I'm coming to Egypt. And when I come, I'm going to strike down the firstborn. Man and beast, I'm going to strike them down. And let me tell you one more thing. I'm going to judge the gods of Egypt. Ligon Duncan explains, everybody at this point has got to be crying out in fear. Surely the Egyptians would have been crying out to their gods for the lives of their children, and God is going to show those false gods to be utterly impotent against the power of his judgment. Now they will know that I am the Lord. Can you feel a bit of the horror of Moses' first hearing Pharaoh say, I'm not familiar with this God. I'm not sure I've ever heard his name. I don't know who he is. Can you feel a little bit of Moses' horror knowing that the God of the universe, the God of the world, would not be trifled with. And here God announced at the end, I will judge the gods of Egypt. And Pharaoh thinks he's one of those gods. And then he will know my name again. He will know that I am the Almighty One. And then he tells them in verse 13, this blood that you shed through the killing of the lamb is going to be a sign of my sparing of you. This blood is a sign of my passing over you in judgment. This blood is a sign that I've not visited you in judgment, but that I've spared you of judgment. And that's so key, because not only is God judging these gods, he's also showing us how we can be spared his judgment. I mean, you might look at what's going on here and ask, how is it that Israel, who seems so sinful, was spared this judgment when Pharaoh and the Egyptians were not? And the emphasis is spared. They did deserve the judgment. What every one of us deserves is death. If God gave the Egyptians and the Israelites and us what we deserved, it would be death for us all. The Israelites were saved because of God's mercy, and more specifically, in the Passover event, we see God showed mercy to the Israelites by providing a substitute for their sons. The title of Passover comes from the image of God passing over his people instead of punishing them through the killing of their firstborn representative. And this protection happened only through the means of the blood of a sacrificed, unblemished lamb, which was placed on the doorpost as a sign to Yahweh. And this bloody sacrificial imagery suggests a salvation made possible through penal substitution. And that is so key. Let me quote again. The Israelites did not earn their rescue from Egypt. They did not merit their rescue from Egypt. They did not deserve their rescue from the destroyer. They received deliverance from the bounty of God's grace by the blood of the slain lamb, which was an instrument of God's merciful choosing. And so in a real sense, we can say that the Passover lambs brought Israel out of Egypt. Without the blood of the lamb, there would have been no Israel to bring out of Egypt. Just like without the blood of the lamb, there would be no rescue for us. Once Israel is released, God guides the people's path, but Pharaoh hardens his heart and he chases them again. You know the story. And again, this is part of God's purpose in helping Israel get to know him. But in spite of all that they've seen, the people are frightened, but Moses calls on the people to believe, and God explains again why he's allowing this to happen in chapter 14, verses 17 and 18, which is a key verse in the book of Exodus. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots and his horsemen, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gained glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. God delivers Israel in a miraculous way, demonstrating that he is a God who hears, who remembers, and who saves. And at first they seem to get it. Exodus 15 concludes by showing how God's people should respond to the salvation God's provided, and by showing some of the struggles that they actually face to really trust God. But they sing a song in Exodus 15 which shows that God is more powerful than Pharaoh, the sea and the nations. And the center of this song is Exodus 15:11. Where Moses cries out, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? And yet this song clearly looks forward to a greater deliverance when God establishes his kingdom on earth. And actually, this is the first place in the Bible where God is called king. And the prophets later will pick up on this song and this Exodus to point to a greater deliverance from God. You can see that in Jeremiah 16, Ezekiel 20, Micah 7. Unfortunately, though, Israel begins well by praising God. It isn't much later that they respond to this great deliverance by complaining, Exodus 15:24. And God responds to their complaints by providing for their needs and making them a pivotal promise. If you'll just obey, I'll reverse the curse and you'll experience tremendous blessing, which was a huge opportunity for them, obviously. And so after delivering them, showing them mercy, revealing himself to them, and making this promise, we're going to see that God takes them into the wilderness for a time of testing. But that's our next video. So come back.